Hi there, indie author friends. Today we're going to be starting a mini-series on Indie Author Blueprint, all devoted to editorial needs for self-publishing authors. Now, this is going to be covering you yourself hiring an editor. So if you're going with a self-publishing company and you're not hiring the editor yourself, there are some things that you still are going to get out of this mini-series because there are a lot of things you're going to be doing ahead of time. And so you'll learn some things about that. And then you also might want to hire somebody to do certain aspects of this before it goes to that publisher. So hang in there because there's something for you here as well. But for the author who's doing it all and you are hiring an editor and then you are publishing the book yourself, we're going to start at the beginning. So first we're going to look at editorial needs. And then in the upcoming episodes, we're going to look at some of the mistakes that indie authors make. There will be an episode with some self-editing tips on cleaning it up before sending it to an editor. And there will be a tip sheet that will be available for the paid subscribers to Indie Author Blueprint on that one as well. I will talk about what to look for in a book editor, what to do when you get your edits back. What do you do next? And then the role of beta readers and sensitivity readers. And I'm sure I'll think of some more things along the way, but that is the outline for the next couple of episodes here on Indie Author Blueprint. So today, let's get started looking at sort of an overview of why I'm talking about this. Some of you are going to relate to the idea of being really neat and tidy writers. This means that you don't make a lot of mistakes and you don't need a ton of editing. But I will tell you that every single person I know needs an editor. I am a professional editor. I edit books for other people, and yet I hire an editor to go over my own work. Even though I have polished it up as clean as it can possibly get, she always finds things that I missed. And I've had some embarrassing typos on some things that I didn't have anyone even proofread. And, even using Grammarly and all of those tools, I still have made some really big mistakes. So it's really important that we know that we all need to have an editor. Now, a traditional publisher will do many rounds of edits, and I'm going to give an overview of what some of those are. And as an indie author, you're going to use some of these as well. But when you self-publish, you're probably going to do some of these in non-traditional ways. That means you might be hiring friends or not even hiring. You might be trading chocolate for editing in some of these rounds. And in other places, you're going to be definitely paying a professional. Now, why am I talking about this? Because when I published my first book, which I indie published, I hired a company and they had their own editors. They had their own designers. I didn't like, first off, the covers that they had. We're going to be talking about covers in the next mini-series, so hang in there if you're wondering about covers. But I also didn't know anything about their editor. So I hired my own cover designer and I used their editor. Well, when I got back the first round of edits, the copy edits, I was really disappointed. First off, the editor had not tracked the changes, and edits should always have the changes tracked. It should always be possible for you to accept or reject what they did because they might have made a mistake or they might have misunderstood what you were trying to say. So it's always important to see what they did and know what your original words were and what they did, because you can toggle in Word back and forth between the original and the changes, and you can see what was done. So first off, that was a huge issue for me. That was a long time ago. So now some software exists where you can compare the two documents in Word and essentially get track changes. But at that time, that was not a feature in Word. And so that was a problem. The other thing is that editor added in mistakes. So she did catch some of my mistakes, some spelling mistakes and stuff like that. But in her editing, she added in some mistakes. Now, of course, there's always going to be some of the possibility that your editor leaned on the keyboard or something and added mistakes. Know that is going to happen sometimes, and that's part of being human. But I'm saying that she added in mistakes that I knew were incorrect. For example, I had some incomplete sentences because I write humor, and so I use a lot of incomplete sentences for the purpose of humor. And so to fix those, she didn't like them. She added in ellipses and some other punctuation that shouldn't have been there. And so I had to go through and remove this. And here's why. It is like a mark of a amateur author to have a ton of ellipses in your book manuscript. And so they're used for trailing off thoughts and for quoting something and leaving a little middle part out or something, but it isn't something you use for splicing sentences together or thoughts together. And so when I opened it, I already, even as a really inexperienced author, I already knew that was a problem. And one of the things I had not done or received from the publisher even was any kind of request for me to say, like, these are my preferences, like a cover letter or something that says, I write humor and I want the incomplete sentences left there. There were other things. That's just an example of some of the problems that were there. And so it's really important to know who you're getting as an editor, because I ended up having to pass it around to some friends to help me out and figure out where some of the issues were, because I knew I hadn't had a really great edit. And now when I look back, there are a ton of things I still would fix on that manuscript. It's been out for quite a while. It was published over a decade ago. And, it was actually 13 years ago. And that book is selling well enough that I've just left it alone. I've just left it, and it's embarrassing. So if you ever pick up my first book, you might wonder about the fact that I call myself a professional editor. That was before I knew better. Okay, so in this episode, we're going to be talking about why editing is so critical for self-publishing success and why it impacts the reader experience and your credibility and your professionalism. And then this is just an overview of the different types of editing, and then we're going to go in depth in the weeks that are coming. So let's start with that. Let's start with an overview of different types of editing. Now, the first one is developmental editing. And now I want you to know, I'm going to give a little caveat here. Depending on what source you look at, there are different ways that people define what each of these edits include. And so that's important to also do your homework and ask them specifically what they're giving you for this, because it's not the same. I wish it were, but it isn't. So developmental editing also has some other names. Some editors will also call this substantive editing, structural editing, content editing, manuscript editing, book editing. There are different terms for it, but they basically mean the same thing. And it means that they're looking at the big picture of your written work. So whether it's a book or an article or your academic paper, but we're talking about books, they're looking at the big picture, the whole structure of it, the theme. And this is going to be very different from fiction and nonfiction, because fiction has a story arc and plot and all of that. And there's definitely a developmental factor that's different in that than in somebody who's publishing a memoir or a self-help book or something like that. So that's important to know that there are different kinds. Now, I recently picked up a resource, and if you go over to the University of Chicago Press website, who publishes the Chicago Manual of Style, they have a whole bookstore there with a lot of really great resources. And as an editor and a writer, I pick up these resources, and I will link to this one in the show notes. But there is one on developmental editing. It's a handbook for freelancers, authors, and publishers. And in this one, the author, Scott Norton, he defines developmental editing as significant structuring or restructuring of a manuscript's discourse. The developmental editor's role can manifest in a number of ways. Some big picture editors provide broad direction by helping the author form a vision for the book, then coaching the author chapter by chapter to ensure that the vision is successfully executed. Others get their hands dirty with the prose itself, suggesting rewrites at the chapter, section, paragraph, and sentence levels. This hands-on approach is sometimes called substantive editing or line editing. So in this book, developmental, he talks about how it can mean a lot of things. And so it's really important that if you're going to work with an editor, that you check with them to find out what they mean by what they're offering to you. So when somebody comes to me and says they want developmental editing, I ask specifically what they're struggling with, because some writers have experienced this kind of editing with somebody else where they were really picking it apart and even maybe changing the voice some. And others have experienced it in more of a big picture overall coaching where the editor didn't really read word for word, but gave a general impression of the project. And so this can be very different, and it can cost very different prices depending on what you're looking at. The most important thing to know is that this happens early in the process. This is especially for first-time authors. If you have never tackled a complex genre, especially if you're writing like historical fiction or something that has a really complicated story arc, or something that has two completely different centuries, or you have multiple points of view, all of that kind of stuff, it's really important to have somebody coaching you on that. Or if you are a speaker and you're trying to put the content of your speaking into a nonfiction book, you might hire somebody to help you brainstorm an outline and kind of a whole plan for the book, even before you write it, where they help you come up with a formula that you follow for each chapter. I've done this with ghostwriting before, where I sit down with the author with a nonfiction book and we talk through what we're going to have at the opening of each chapter and what sorts of features we're going to be including in the book and what kinds of call to action will happen in every single chapter. And we create this formula that I use then when I put together the content when I'm ghostwriting. So all of this happens early on in the process. Now, I mentioned that Scott Norton in this definition also calls this line editing, or says that, some editors call it that. Line editing is slightly different in that it mostly focuses on clarity and flow. So this might be looking at sentence structure, word choice, readability, and about making the writing flow smoothly, fixing awkward phrasing, pointing out different tone that needs to be fixed, or tightening paragraphs and talking about reader engagement, like hooks at the beginning of a chapter, that kind of thing. It's really important to do this before copy editing, because you're going to end up having some stuff undone. You're going to make mistakes while you're doing this. And so you don't want to have it all cleaned up and then you go back and do this. The important thing to know is that this is not copy editing, and I'll get to that definition in a second. But when you are doing developmental editing or line editing, those early on big picture edits, you're not looking at spelling, you're not looking at grammar. And this is hard for me as an editor, actually, because I notice those things. I just see all the detail. So sometimes I'll put a note in the margin just saying, say, author friend, you're going to want to go through the book and look for the spelling of this word because I notice it's wrong here, and just do a search through. Or for the record, you should hyphenate numbers or whatever. I'll give a few of those notes, but then I try to turn that part of my brain off and move on, because I'm not there to fix that. I'm not there to add commas and all that kind of stuff. We're looking at the big picture. Okay, so then the third type of editing that I want to talk about, because I'm grouping developmental and line editing into the big picture as number 1 and number 2. The third one is copy editing, and this is grammar, punctuation, consistency. This also includes some flow, but a lot of it is not as much of the reworking of it as just maybe popping the phrase that you have at the end to the beginning or something like that and polishing it up, but it doesn't really change much about the actual structure of your writing. So it's polishing grammar, it's punctuation, it's spelling, it's looking at consistency in language, looking at consistency in names. Like if you changed your character's name partway through and you forgot that there might be some possessive forms of it when you searched and did a search and find and replace, your editor should hopefully figure out that, oh yeah, that wasn't the name of the main character. Names of places I've caught sometimes in editing fiction where the name of a town was changed or something like that in the writing process and one got missed. Spelling of, if you picked a name for your company that your main character works for and then it's suddenly spelled differently. Those are things that like the editor needs to keep a little list in their head or on a spreadsheet and go back and look at those things in fiction especially. Your editor will be looking at verb tenses. If you keep going back and forth between present and past tense, they're working on fixing that. They're looking at awkward sentences that they had to read multiple times, and they might either fix it or flag it for you to go back and fix it, because it's important that they don't override your voice. And so sometimes it means you have to go back and fix it to just really be in the character's mindset, especially in dialogue. I edit a lot of Christian writing, and so that means I edit Bible studies and devotionals and stuff like that. So I'm looking at scripture references and actually comparing word for word. A lot of authors type them and they miss all the punctuation and the words. If you are writing this, please copy and paste from a source like Bible Gateway and just save yourself some time. But also then what happens, even if somebody copies and pastes, they type in the reference, and I've noticed so often they get the book of the Bible wrong or the chapter and verse wrong. So those all have to be checked. Nonfiction also should have footnotes, and your editor is going to check the footnotes to see if you quoted accurately. They might give you a lecture about it if you didn't. I try not to lecture, but that's super important that you get those right. They're going to look at the format of the footnotes to make sure they match the Chicago Manual of Style. They're going to look at the spelling of every proper noun or place, because you would be surprised. For instance, I do a lot of editing for an organization that has a location in Columbia. And at first I was like spelling Columbia with a U. And then I was like, wait a second, Columbia is COLO for the country. And so it's really important to get those things right. You would be amazed at how many people I've seen have spelled Will Ferrell, the actor's name, wrong. So those are things that they look at. Comma rules. There's so many different rules out there and preferences. And so your editor's going to discuss that with you and follow the Chicago Manual of Style. Hyphenation rules, the same thing. A lot of authors are using British words instead of English words, and they just don't know it. Like, I walked toward the house, not towards the house. Towards is the British version. And so your editor should catch that and switch it to toward without the S. Okay, so if I'm making your brain hurt, this is all really important. Copy editing to me is the thing that stands out. Like, when I pick up a book and I am deciding online, especially if I'm just paging through Amazon, looking at self-published books, and I'm trying to decide if I want to purchase one, I read the sample pages, and if I see a ton of copy editing errors in the beginning, and I'm not talking the ones that we just disagree or agree on, like whether we should use the Oxford comma or not or something like that. I'm talking actual lots of mistakes. I don't want to read any further, and I'm not purchasing the book. And so it's super important that you have your book copy edited. Okay, the fourth one that I'm going to talk about, and again, there's so many different ones in between here. There's also, this is not an official numbered one, but ghostwriting is where maybe somebody has actually put together a draft of a book, and it's sort of like ghostwriting, but some editors call it book doctoring, where they take your really, really messy draft and they actually rewrite it into a book that's publishable. That's like on the really far end of not even so much editing, but actually writing your content, all the way down to this one, which is the fourth one that I want to talk about today, and that's proofreading. This is the simplest of all. This is the final polish. This is looking through to see, are there any last minute typos that happened? And actually, some publishers do this before typesetting. And actually you should do this. So if you have your book copy edited by a professional editor, you and a couple friends should still read through your book and proofread it before it gets typeset, because you're going to be looking for any of the typos that maybe happened during the editing process, like the word got deleted and half of it stayed or something, or you're going to be looking for any missed mistakes that didn't get caught by the editor. But you're also going to do a final proofread after your book is typeset and formatted, and it's like in the version it's going to go to print on, because there are going to be some things that maybe happened during typesetting. Maybe a word got broken in half and you need to fix that. Maybe there's some formatting issues, like the header on the top of the page is missing or something. So that final proofread could either be the quick one that you do before it gets typeset, or it could also refer to the one that is on the finished copy that's formatted, and some people call that the galley copy. So that's just looking for any final missed mistakes. Now, this should not be a whole, like a ton of edits on every page, because you're going to drive your typesetter crazy trying to fix those. So catch them before you get to that. All right, let's talk about why each stage matters. Why would you want to go through all of these? And like I said, traditional publishers have people on staff who do this. So number one, they are going to have a developmental editor, but they expect your book to be in pretty good shape when it comes to them, but they might have some creative ideas that they want you to incorporate and make some changes. Or there may be some issues with the plot in your fiction and they want to work on that, or suspense or something like that. They are going to have somebody who does the line edit, and then somebody who does the copy editing, and someone who proofreads, and someone who proofreads again after the book is typeset. And then there's probably, I don't know how many different people in there. But those stages matter because without developmental editing, you might have character issues or plot issues, and it just doesn't resonate with the reader. And so it adds a level of clarity and smoothness to it. And the copy editing is important because there's so many amateur mistakes that especially new writers make. And so it keeps you from embarrassment. And self-published authors honestly are scrutinized more harshly because people are just looking to prove that you made a mistake. So it's really important to go through these phases. But I said in the beginning that we sometimes get creative, and here's how. If we were doing all of this, we'd probably have to set aside $6,000 to $10,000 to hire enough people to coach us and do all these levels of edits, because you can't expect somebody to spend 40 hours on your book for free, or 30 hours or 20 or whatever they're taking in those different levels. And so we get creative because our friends are sometimes willing to like get the first peek at it. And so they might be reading through and giving you feedback on just what resonates with them, what doesn't. You know, here's this little thing here I got kind of hung up on. So they might be actually helping you with some of that developmental stuff that, you didn't catch. They also might be pretty good at spotting some mistakes. Now, in future episodes, we're going to talk about why you do have to have a professional editor and why somebody who's just an English teacher. Oh, I shouldn't say just an English teacher, because I have a child who's an English teacher. So I'm going to say that somebody who's not familiar with the publishing standards and all the rules that come with that are different from what we learn in English class. There, did that help clarify that? So we're going to be talking about that more in depth, but you want to have somebody who could spot some typos, who's good about commas. If they're not, just know that your professional editor will catch some of that. But you probably can have some friends do some of this to get it down to the basics. And you might even get it down to where you need just a basic proofread because you got it cleaned up really well. Your editor will look at it and give you a quote based on how much work it looks like it needs. So these stages are all important. And if you can't afford to do it the way a traditional publisher does, you still need to have that book in the hands of some people to get that feedback and to have them help you spot the mistakes you can't see. Now, how do you determine what your manuscript needs? Well, in genres like memoir, which is story-based, or literary fiction, the developmental editing helps you shape the emotional arc. And mystery might require a heavier focus on plot consistency or pacing. And so there are some writing coaches and writing groups. I used to go to a critique group where we would read things out loud. And so there are some ways that you can get that help there. And those people that are reading it and coaching you might also tell you what kind of editor you need next. So that's one way of determining. The other one is looking at like the audience. Who is the audience for? So you're going to be determining like, I'm going to need an editor that helps me figure out if this tone is good for this like young reader, for example. So there might be some genre specific things. And so you're going to be looking for editors that are very familiar with the genre that you write in. And then the other thing that helps you determine what it needs is your level of experience. So if you're new to writing and you're just starting out in fiction, you might want to have a lot more editing because you're going to need heavier editing. It's just common. Like, as great of a writer as we can be and as great of a concept as we can come up with, there still is a lot that has to be cleaned up. And the less experience we have, the more editing we need. That's just how it is. So I don't need as much now than I did 20 years ago when I was starting out. So if you are not a seasoned writer, you probably want to think about budgeting for a couple of rounds of professional editing or coaching or book doctoring or whatever you need. Now, speaking of budgeting, you get what you pay for. So editing is an investment in your book's quality and marketability. And so a good editor can elevate your manuscript in ways that are often hard to quantify, but they can have a really big impact on your book's success. So you do need to understand that your editors don't work for free and they have bills to pay and everything too. And so prices can really vary depending on the editor's experience, the project's complexity. Oh, I can't say that word today. So how complex your project is. And there are some charts that you can go by that help you. In fact, I'm going to link in the show notes to one that I have found super helpful that some other writers pointed out to me. And that one is from the Editorial Freelancers Association. And actually that website has a lot of helpful stuff, but they have a whole chart of editorial rates, and it's for 2024 as I'm looking at it right now. They looked at the average from November of 2023 through mid-January of 2024 and surveyed different people. And actually, this recording right now is in October of 2024, so I'm guessing that if they do this regularly that there will be an update coming. But they have a 2024 rate chart of all the different types of work that editors do. And there's editorial rates per word, per hour, consulting, coaching, and then broken down by academic, business fiction, medical, all of those kinds of things, because the editing is different and the level of what people need is different with each of those. So it's super helpful. And then it also includes some caveats for like how experienced your editor is. So there's a big range, like some of them might be ranging from $60 to $90 an hour for heavy, like really heavy editing. That one's a big one. There are some that are, I'm going to scrolling here to look through. There's some that are like $40 to $50 an hour for academic. And then some novels that are like $38 to $55 an hour. That's just an hourly rate. A lot of people are by the word. And so they have that listed there too. So you really need to do the math. And then you can see like, okay, based on that, especially with the word count, you can do the math and figure out how much you have to budget and look at what you need. Now, as we wrap up today, I want to help you to understand that it can be really overwhelming. It can feel overwhelming to start thinking about editing. And so what happens is a lot of times writers will just decide, well, I'm just going to do it myself. I'm just going to get it really clean. I'm going to use Grammarly. I'm going to use spell check. This is going to be good enough. And so there's a risk because sometimes people want to cut corners. And hiring an inexperienced or low-cost editor might save you money, but it can lead to missed errors or unprofessional quality, and that hurts the book's reception. And so if your book flops at launch because you get a lot of feedback that says you should have hired an editor, you don't want to skip that step. I'm going to be talking in the next episode about some of the mistakes that writers make when hiring an editor, so I won't really get into that too much right now. But just recapping today, there are different types of editing. We talked about why they matter and how to determine what your manuscript needs and why paying for quality is worth the investment. And so I want you to look at your current work and think about which editing steps you might need and start thinking about how to budget for it as you're looking ahead to publishing your book. Now, we're going to go into more, like I said, next time about the common mistakes that people make. But for today, I'll give you those resources in the show notes on Substack so that you can really look at that editing rates chart, and that will help you to do some planning. And then next week, we'll talk about the mistakes that people make and how we can avoid those pitfalls. So thanks for being here, and I will see you in the next episode. This has been Indie Author Blueprint, and you will find more along with practical resources when you search on Substack for Indie Author Blueprint. I have lots of stuff on there. I'm growing the content. It's just launched a few months ago, and so it will be walking you all the way through all of these steps that are involved in publishing your own book. So join me on Substack, Indie Author Blueprint.